few watery scenes are quite complete without birds in the picture. Think of ducks drifting across a country pond, gulls wheeling in the sky above the beach before they dive-bomb an unsuspecting tourist for their chips, or kingfishers flashing along a river, a bright dazzle of colour against the water. They're so much a part of the scenery that aquatic birds have had a long relationship with humans. In some cases, that link has been much more literal. For example, some believed that drowned seamen became gulls, so capturing a gull and keeping it on a ship brought bad luck. But with such a long relationship comes folklore. These birds predict the weather, foretell death, ward off intruders, or enjoy holy protection. So we're going to have a look at the folklore associated with the cormorant, curlew, duck, goose, kingfisher and puffin in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well. We are now into August, and because August has 5 weeks, there's going to be 5 different episodes for our current theme, which is the folklore of birds, which was actually a listener request, and I have actually had quite a few people messaging about if I'm going to include specific birds, so that is very cool. And we're starting off with aquatic birds first. Now obviously there's a lot more birds than I can fit into this episode, so I have had to be choosy. So if I have missed out one that you would like to have learnt more about, then obviously I will no doubt circle back and cover these again at some point in the future. There is one notable exception to that. I haven't included swans because there is already a bonus episode about that for Patreon supporters, so obviously I didn't want to kind of include that because it's already an exclusive for them. So if you are interested, you can always become a member of the Fabulous Folklore family for £3.50 a month or more. But anyway, that's why swans aren't in this one. But we're going to start off with the cormorant, and you can find cormorants both in coastal regions or you can also find them inland at rivers or lakes, and you can usually spot them perched on something and they've got their wings outstretched to dry, and such is the appearance adopted by Satan in John Milton's Paradise Lost. So yes, he does take the form of a cormorant, which is quite interesting. Now, cormorants were sometimes called the sea crow or coal goose, although they also gained the nickname of Isle of Wight parsons because their shaggy appearance looked like a clergyman's black gown. And indeed, in September 1860, a cormorant took up a perch on St Botolph's Church in Boston, Lincolnshire. When it remained there the following day, the locals decided this must be a bad omen, so the church caretaker shot it. News eventually reached them that the Lady Elgin had sunk on Lake Michigan at the same time that the cormorant had appeared, and 2 of the 300 passengers that were lost were Boston's MP, Herbert Ingram, and his eldest son. Now, Artemidorus, the 2nd century Greek writer and dream interpreter, decreed that cormorants meant danger for sailors, though not necessarily death though, because of the fact that cormorants seemingly couldn't drown, because obviously they can dive and swim and all that kind of thing. But their ability to dive beneath the waves meant that lost things would remain lost. Now we're going to move on to curlews, which are wading birds, often found in moorland in the summer and estuaries in the winter. And in folklore, they're sometimes linked with the 7 whistlers, which I've never really covered on the podcast before, so we'll do it very, very briefly now. And they do appear in both British and Irish folklore, and they're often considered to be a group of birds that flew at night. The type of birds that the whistlers are does vary depending on where you are and which story you're looking at, but obviously in some of them, the curlew is the bird that makes up the 7 whistlers, and their calls always foretold disaster. So as an example, in 1682, locals in Hartley in Northumberland said that they'd heard the birds the night before a dreadful mine disaster that killed 204 miners. Now, like I say, the curlew is believed to be one of these birds that could be in the 7 whistlers, and people actually considered their eerie calls just in general as a bad luck or even death omen. And on one occasion, a flock of curlews flew overhead and a boat overturned, drowning 7 men. Now, the birds were called wished hounds in Devon or Gabriel's hounds near Sheffield, and for some authors, these kind of names evoke the wild hunt, the spectral procession sweeping up souls in its wake, which again, I've never really covered on the podcast, so who knows, maybe I'll come back and have a look at that in the future. But the sound that the curlew makes possibly also explains why in Ayrshire the curlew was called a whaup, which was a goblin that lurked in the eaves of a house at night looking for bad people to spirit away. Now, elsewhere in folklore, curlews were an Irish weather omen, and if a flock was seen going from east to west, it meant frosty weather was incoming, and a constant curlew cry meant rain was on the way. And the latter so closely mimicked a ship's alarm call that coast guards sometimes feared wrecks when they were actually hearing curlews. And we're going to move on to a completely different type of bird. And I'm not going to lie, this is like my second favourite type of bird in this episode. And that's the humble duck. I love ducks. I think they're so cute. They're also incredibly common. Although I should point out that duck refers to quite a wide variety of members of the family. So rather than doing them individually, I've just lumped them all together as ducks. And also, in a somewhat topical twist, given the current Paris Olympics, Sakana, the goddess of the Seine, is sometimes depicted standing in a duck boat. So the boat basically has like the head of a duck at the prow, and it is very, very cool. And ducks were apparently Sakana's familiars, which would make sense for a river goddess. Now, in the Topographia Hibernica, Giraldus Cambrensis talks about teal ducks that lived in Leinster, and they swam in a pool created by the holy spring of St. Colman, and they were actually sacred to the saint. They were so tame that people could hand feed them, but if anyone threatened them or any misfortune befell the church, the teal would fly away until the offenders were punished. And they were apparently so sacred that predators would die after even trying to eat them. If you did somehow manage to pick one up in your bucket of cooking water, although I don't know how you do that without noticing, the water wouldn't boil until you released the teal back into its pool. And even as late as the Norman era, an archer apparently killed one, but the water refused to boil for hours. And it was only when the person's host kind of went, hang on a minute, you've got one of the teals there, that the problem was realised, and the archer apparently died soon after. Now, my personal favourite among the holy ducks is the so-called cuddy ducks of Northumbria. And during the 7th century, St Cuthbert moved to Innerfarn, the largest of the Farne Islands, where he lived as a hermit, which is also much more famous now for boat trips to see the puffins. But in St Cuthbert's day, it was a favoured site for eider ducks to raise their young. Now, the saint was so fond of the ducks that he banned anyone from catching or killing them in the breeding season, and due to his local nickname as Cuddy, the eider ducks gained their new nickname of Cuddy ducks. Now, it does seem that the ducks were so tamed by Cuthbert that they even nested beside the altar at the chapel on Innerfarn. Now, one monk apparently mocked Cuthbert's protection of the ducks and died after doing so. And other monks also suffered for eating or annoying the ducks, so it does seem that Cuthbert's protection continued. And yes, eider ducks are where we get the name eiderdown, referring to the bed covering that preceded the duvet. In other folklore, a Scottish tradition held that ducks were sacred to the Virgin Mary, which meant you couldn't harm a duck with her young. And even ducks offer their own slice of weather folklore, so if ducks quack more or louder than usual, rain is on the way. And we're going to move on to geese, because I think where people often like ducks for being quite comical or even cuddly, they will absolutely hate geese because they can be quite aggressive. And I know when I was doing my masters, the university campus actually was home to flocks of geese that would then congregate at the door to the student union, meaning the students couldn't actually get out unless they wanted to brave the geese. In ancient Greece, geese were actually sacred to Aphrodite, and the ancient Greeks also considered goose fat to be an aphrodisiac, and there are actually some amazing statues showing Aphrodite riding a goose. In ancient Rome, they kept geese as sentries in Juno's temples, and when the Gulls tried to scale the walls at night in around 387 BCE to enter the city, the geese made so much noise that the Roman soldiers woke up and fought off the Gauls, so you can see why geese would have been really useful in that regard. Scholars theorise that geese must have been likewise important to the Celts, after finding a figurine of what might be Brigantia in Brittany with a goose-topped helmet. Now, people sometimes describe Brigantia as a war goddess, and if you are going to associate any bird with war, then I do think geese are actually a pretty good choice. And elsewhere, Epona is sometimes linked with geese as well as horses. Now, Julius Caesar noted that the ancient Britons didn't actually eat geese but kept them for entertainment, although I would argue that if the Britons used them as guard birds the way that the Romans did, it's unsurprising that they might put a prohibition on eating them. Although not so elsewhere in Europe, Germanic people apparently made sacrifices of geese to Odin at the autumn equinox. Obviously, there are various fairy tales as well about geese having the ability to lay golden eggs, and this always then comes down to the idea that you would preserve the goose because then it will continue to lay golden eggs, whereas obviously if you're like the character in the fairy tale that then kills the goose to get at the gold, you've basically then just like cut off your own wealth source. at its origin point. I'm not going to dwell on that too much because I don't really think it's part of folklore because it's more part of fairy tales, but I did just want to acknowledge it. Now, like the other watery birds in this episode, people used geese flight patterns to predict the weather. And in Ireland, winter would be long if the geese arrived early in autumn. If they flew low, it meant rain was on the way, but it would be fine if they flew high. If a goose stretched its neck and then kind of hit itself in the chest with its wings, a gale was coming. And then in England, people actually read the shapes that geese made in the sky to determine how many frosty weeks were ahead of them. Now, the divinatory possibilities didn't just end there either, because tradition dictated that people ate roast goose for Michaelmas Day, so they would dry the breastbone and then check it for omens the following day. So a dark bone meant that they could expect severe weather, although a light one foretold a mild winter. According to Marie Trevelyan, geese laying one soft and one hard egg foretold misfortune in the family, and it was unlucky to bring eggs into or out of the house after dark. If a grey goose wandered into a neighbour's yard, it meant that slander was afoot. Eating goose was bad luck unless you also made a pie or soup from the giblets, and geese wandering from the farmyard and then befriending strangers meant that a fire might break out in your house. And then if a goose flew over the house, it also meant someone inside would die. However, that all sounds quite doom and gloom and death omeny and so on, but on the bright side, finding goose or duck feathers stuck in the ground meant that money or good news would reach you before the end of the day, so that's quite nice. And we also have a standing stone story, and it's quite surprising I didn't come across this when I was doing the standing stones episode, but obviously there's that available if you want to hear it for other stories. But this one is about the standing stones on Addlestrop Hill in Oxfordshire because they're known as the Grey Geese. And according to legend, a woman was driving her flock of geese to pasture when a witch demanded a bird. Now the woman obviously refused, so the witch cast a spell on her. And when the woman awoke hours later, she realised that the geese had all been turned into the standing stones. Which is a bit of a mean thing to do, but there we go. And we're going to move on to the kingfisher. And I've never actually seen a kingfisher in real life, which I find really quite sad because they always look so enchanting when you see them in photographs or even on film, the way that they're really dazzling and so on. Although, while we consider them to be that really dazzling blue, their feathers are apparently not actually that colour in reality because the structure of the feathers actually scatters blue light, meaning that they actually change colour depending on what direction the light's coming from. And at one point, people actually prized kingfisher feathers to ward off lightning or to bring prosperity. This is a bit gross, but people might also hang a dead kingfisher upside down with its wings outstretched, and then they used it as a weather vane because they believed that its beak would point towards the wind. And elsewhere, Giraldus Cambrensis recommended using dead kingfishers to repel moths from your clothes, which does not sound like a very fun thing to do at all. Some people think that their name is a link to the Fisher King from the Grail stories, although I think that's possibly a little bit of a reach, because in 1544 the name was Kingfisher, which is spelled Kyngesfisher, and that's basically where it then over time has evolved into Kingfisher. And because a breeding pair might catch up to 115 fish per day, I can't help thinking that their name just refers to their fishing prowess, because they are the king of the fishers, so it would make sense to call them that. Now, one of their old names was actually Halcyon, and this comes after the Greek myth in which Ceyx, king of Trachis, drowned in a shipwreck, and his wife Alcyone found his body on the shore. Now, the gods actually took pity on them because she was so upset about the loss, and they turned them into birds so that they could then be together forever. Because her father made the sea calm every year so she could build a nest on the ocean's surface, the settled weather in November became known as Halcyon days. Now, this often falls around the 11th of November or the Feast of St. Martin, so you won't be surprised to hear that the bird was sacred to St. Martin. And just as a side issue, Alcyone is also the brightest star in the Pleiades constellation as well, which I think possibly rises around about the same time as well. I think it might rise in October, but obviously these kind of things do change over time. But yeah, I just thought that was cool. And we're going to move on to my final aquatic bird of this episode, and this is my absolute favourite bird. I always feel, I love ravens and things like that, but I feel like I'm a bit of a rubbish goth because my favourite bird is the puffin. I think they're so cute. And they are sometimes called sea parrots, and in the north they were sometimes referred to as a coulter neb, with neb referring to their bill and coulter being a plough blade. And you'll sometimes hear the word neb in the northern word, or Geordie word in particular, for if somebody's being overly curious, you're being nebby, because you're being nosy. Many people do consider puffins to be quite clownish, which possibly explains why a group of puffins is called a circus. In Scotland, some people call them a tammy norrie, which was also a term that referred to a boy too shy to approach a girl. And they do look quite bashful when you see them. And in Northumberland, we actually call them tommy noddies as well, which I think is quite cute. Now, their Latin name for Turcula arctica meant little friar of the Arctic, thanks to the fact that many hermits and missionaries lived on islands frequented by puffins. And one of these was Inner Farm, home to St Cuthbert, who we met earlier. And yes, he is more famous for his link with the eider ducks. He was depicted in the late 19th century as an early environmentalist, particularly protecting birds. Obviously, the National Trust now look after the Inner Farm, so you can now once again take a boat trip over to the Inner Farm to actually see the puffins, and I did that back in 2019 before the bird flu outbreak, and they're so cute. They really are, just watching them kind of running around everywhere and sort of shouting at each other because they're really sociable birds. But you can see why, if Cuthbert was fond of the eider ducks, I imagine he was probably quite fond of the puffins as well. But the Christian connection also continues because the Pictish saint Ethanen lived on the Isle of May and the Firth of Forth, also favoured by puffins. And in Ireland, some believed that they were actually the souls of monks, which explained why some people wouldn't eat puffins. In Iceland, people used them as a weather forecaster thanks to their ability to survive storms at sea. And if you actually saw them flying back into land, that was considered a sign that a storm was coming. And fishermen also used puffin dive sites to help guide them to the best fishing spots. So what do we make of this folklore of aquatic birds? I think we can see maybe 4 key themes among these particular birds that I've chosen. And the first is the use of birds as weather omens, which isn't surprising if you've got these birds associated with coastal areas in particular. If they behave in a particular way, you would soon start to notice, oh, hang on, every time the bird's flying from this direction, we get a storm. And they're flying in from that direction because they know a storm's coming. So it's not necessarily divination in a more mystical sense, it's more an observational sense in that regard, which I think is quite cool. So we've got the weather omens, which, as I say, make sense. You also have the death omens, and I think these ones are probably more likely just coincidence that someone has heard a particularly distinctive call of a bird and then something horrible has happened and then they've linked the two. It doesn't take into account all the times that you've heard that particular noise and someone hasn't died, or indeed all the time someone has died and there hasn't been a bird call. And I think it is interesting that they get associated with particular birds that are really distinctive. Like, for example, the cormorant being seen as almost a death omen for what was happening with the boat wreck on Lake Michigan. Cormorants are really distinctive. As I say, the curlew call is really distinctive. So you can see why people would start to link those two together. Whereas something like a duck, which you see all the time, it would be really hard to see that as a death omen, because, you know, you see them so regularly if you live somewhere near where ducks are. We also have the birds under holy protection, and a lot of these birds are associated with either gods, goddesses, or indeed saints. And I think that's really interesting because it doesn't always necessarily make sense from a religious point of view, like why a particular saint would like eider ducks other than because that particular saint just really liked the animal. So I think it's quite interesting that they end up with this holy protection purely because of the fact that that particular saint was fond of them. And this leads us on to the final theme, and that's the idea of companionship and protective services. So I think the fact that the eider ducks, for example, became Cuthbert's companions on an island where he literally didn't see people could help to explain his fondness for them. But then when we look at something like the goose, you know, some people do keep them as pets, I guess, but the fact that they also are quite useful because they're so noisy. And people do sometimes use them instead of guard dogs because of the fact that they're quite happy to kick up a fuss and they are quite aggressive as well. So I think that you can see why these birds, people have found uses for them. Literally in the case of kingfishers with like using them as moth repellent or whatever, but also using them to show you where the best fishing sites are, to ward off intruders, or at least to alert you that there are intruders there, or just simply to keep around for companionship. So I think it's quite interesting that these aquatic birds do have both a positive and a negative relationship with humans, depending on whether they're seen as a good omen or a death omen. So it is interesting to see how it's attached with these birds associated with water. Next week will be birds of prey, so I hope that you enjoy that episode as well. And then I think after that it might be garden birds, and then I think I was going to do ornamental birds and then finishing off with mythical birds, so you know what's coming throughout August. And also, just as a final call, on Monday the 5th of August I am doing my talk on the folklore of magical trees, which will look at elder, rowan, hazel and hawthorn, and that is with Cresswell Crags, and that will be at 6 p.m. and you can grab your ticket. Basically, if you grab your ticket, it means you'll get sent the Zoom link at the link in the show notes below. Although they do close the ticket sales, I think it's about 24 hours in advance. So hopefully if you wanted to attend that, you'll have seen it in time. But anyway, thank you for listening as always, and I will see you next week when we have a look at the folklore of birds of prey. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.